Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Rachel Massey, who is Senior Science and Policy Advisor at the Collaborative for Health and Environment and a Senior Research Associate at the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production at the University of Massachusetts. Today, we are talking about a very important topic to me, artificial sports turf. We talk about materials, chemical compounds, health effects, alternatives, and ways to stay safe. So stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Rachel Massey, who is Senior Science and Policy Advisor at the Collaborative for Health and Environment and a Senior Research Associate at the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. She has over 2 decades of experience working at the intersection of public interest science and policymaking in state, national, and international arenas. Until recently, she served as Senior Associate Director at the Toxics Use Reduction Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, where her projects included state, federal, and international chemicals policy initiatives, analyzing toxics use reduction opportunities for businesses and communities, and working in partnership with small businesses and grassroots organizations addressing toxics at the community level. She has received several notable awards for her work and authored numerous reports and articles on chemicals policy and safer alternatives. She received a Master's of Science in Environmental Change and Management from Oxford University, a Master of Public Affairs from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, which is right here in Princeton, where I am, and a Doctor of Science in Work Environment from the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. Dr. Massey, welcome to the Smart Human Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
So I saw a podcast that you were on. You were actually the star of the show, discussing amongst, a lot of health professionals and researchers, turf, sports turf. And this has been on my mind for a lot of years because, I study this material, but mostly because I have 2 kids and who are athletes, and we have been doing this athletic business, club and sports, for a very long time. So I want to dive right in because this means so much to me, and I'm hoping to a lot of our audience listening. First of all, how did you get into studying, environmental chemicals, but also how this kind of funneled down into the work you're doing as well on synthetic sports turf?
Yeah, well, so this particular project came out of work that I was doing at the Massachusetts Toxics Use Reduction Institute. And so the Toxics Use Reduction Institute is one of the implementing entities of the Massachusetts Toxics Use Reduction Act. And so it's a state program that has a mandate to work with businesses and communities to find ways to reduce the use of toxic chemicals as a way to protect public health and the environment. So in that work, I was fielding, and my colleagues were fielding, all sorts of questions on any number of topics. And the artificial turf topic was one of many that came to us. And so it was quite a few years ago at this point where we started getting calls from concerned community members and decision makers at school boards and municipalities who had a lot of questions about discussions they were having about installation of artificial turf. At the time, the questions were pretty much all focused around the use of waste tire materials in artificial turf, and we can talk more about that. But so we just started looking into it, and honestly, I initially thought it was going to be a few hours just to kind of find out what's in tires, what are the other materials, what are the safer alternatives, get back to them and we'll be done. And it turned out to be just more complicated than that. And we kept getting more and more questions. But anyway, so that's how we got into this topic. So it was part of this larger context of work on toxics use reduction.
Got it. And so tell us a little bit about how, big of how many turf fields, I was looking into this, just in preparation for our conversation. Most of these fields, began in the 1960s. There was some work, the Houston Astros, and that's how it got the term AstroTurf, was because Monsanto's chem grass, as it was called, was put down first in the Houston Astrodome in the 1960s. But that kind of set off, $1 billion industry. And we have somewhere between, I guess, 1,200 and 1,500 new turf fields being added annually, according to the Synthetic Turf Council, which really holds a lot of these details. So tell me how big of, an expanse of this material is out there, and what are you seeing? Is it more popular as we move forward, or where is the sentiment right now?
Yeah. So I think you've got the latest figures there, which is great. I guess, every artificial turf field that's installed is a very large quantity of rubber and plastic. So just think about the size of a soccer field or a football field, and then think about filling all of that with rubber and plastic. It's a large quantity of material. And, so we heard from communities over the years that were looking at installing these fields. And now we're also hearing from communities where those fields that they installed a decade ago have gotten to the end of their useful life. And they're trying to figure out how to dispose of them and whether to replace them with new artificial turf fields or whether to go back to natural grass. So it's a significant quantity of material that is being installed every time an artificial turf field is put in, or every time it's replaced. There's also just a lot of material that migrates off these fields. So those, we can talk about the sort of like the sections and layers of an artificial turf field, but so there's this layer of infill, which is often made from waste tires, but it can also be made from other materials like other types of rubber, other types of plastic or plant-based materials, or combinations of mineral-based and synthetic materials. So you've got kids going on the field and then coming back off the field and tracking that infill back out into the environment, or you're clearing snow off the field and that rubber infill is going off the field into the environment. So it's not just the quantity that you put in when you first install it, it's also the amount that has to be replenished every year as the infill migrates off into the environment, and as those plastic grass blades degrade over time and also migrate into the environment.
Right. So the life of, I guess, first of all, the life of most fields I got off the internet and some research as 10 years. Is that more or less
about right?
The life of a turf field?
Yeah.
And when they put in a turf field, I have somewhere between 40,000 tires per field are crumpled up.
That's right.
And 200,000 to 495,000 pounds of infill fill one field, one football size field,
right?
And that's about 2 to 3 pounds of crumb tire per square foot, and it's about 2 to 3 inches deep. And anyone who has kids or plays themselves on sports, these turf fields, you squish and squish as you're walking. I mean, it gives that bounce. Yeah. But you also really can't get away. I mean, any step or anytime the ball hits the field, I literally from the sidelines watching my kids will see a plume of these tire crumb going up in the air. So they don't often stay limited to the ground. They come up and down with each step and that kind of thing. So
exactly.
It's pretty interesting to tie it to the numbers, because 40,000 tires is a lot of tires, which they claim that they're doing us all a favor by putting it into turf, according to the, the council. So, So what say you? I mean, it's moving in a direction where you think there might be pushback now, right? In terms of the regulation and not so much the regulation, but in terms of the sentiment of schools and communities.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll just say, you mentioned the large number of tires that can be used per field. And, so this is part of the larger tire economy. So a large number of waste tires are generated every year in the economy. And then most of those tires don't get recycled to make new tires. So then there is a constant effort to find other places to put those waste tires. And some decades ago, there were serious problems with large tire stockpiles, right? So like vast stockpiles of waste tires, and they created all sorts of problems. They would collect rainwater, and then mosquitoes would breed in those little puddles made within the tires. And then periodically tire piles would catch fire, and those tire fires were extremely difficult to extinguish. So there have been tire fires that have burned for months in some cases. And so there's this effort to find other ways to use tires. But the problem, of course, is if you use that waste material as a play surface, you're exposing children to it for the entire time that it's a play surface. And then at the end, it's still a waste product. So then you roll back up that artificial turf, and again, it goes straight back into stockpiles. So now instead of being a tire stockpile, it's a stockpile of rolls of waste artificial turf. Anyway, but I think you were asking about kind of the changing views of communities and where things are headed. So yeah, so there's definitely, in the years that I've been fielding questions about this, I have definitely seen trends where an increasing number of communities seem to be concerned about this, and increasingly school board members and board of health members are getting in touch with us and are concerned about their responsibilities with regard to these materials. And a number of communities are taking, a variety of approaches. So some communities have opted to adopt a moratorium on installation of new artificial turf fields. In some cases, it's a moratorium on artificial turf across the board. In other cases, they're just putting a moratorium on installation of that tire crumb infill. In other cases, communities are focusing on PFAS, the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are found in that turf system as well.
Interesting. And just from a historical point of view, I mean, when I was looking at some of the research, I mean, the EPA had a report back from research from 2008. And I think this is back when I actually, printed out all this stuff back in the day. And so this was really the starting point, I guess. One of the first studies was in 2008 and published in this 2009 report from the EPA. But it left a lot of open-ended questions and didn't really move the needle very much. And then fast forward, I guess, to 2017, I think, even communities like, the Mount Sinai, Children's Environmental Health Center, they actually formally came out with, their official statement on moratorium on the use of artificial turf generated from recycled tire crumbs. So, I think we've come a long way. Let's get into the reason why turf is a problem. Okay, let's go. That was the big picture. So tell me a little bit about what are the ingredients that are most commonly found, because there's a lot of varieties, and then what have we found from the science in terms of health effects?
Yeah. So in terms of health concerns, I'll start with just what's in an artificial turf system. So it's basically a carpet product. So you've got that carpet backing, and then the carpet fibers are those artificial grass blades. And then there's a layer of infill, which is interspersed among the grass blades, and as you said, that provides cushioning, keeps the grass blades,
keeps the blades up,
right? Keeps them in place and provides resiliency. And then below that, depending on the system, there might be an additional shock absorbing surface, a shock pad if that's needed, and then below that there would be additional layers of drainage. So multiple layers of the structure. And in terms of the infills, so the very widely used infill is made from waste tires, and there has been a lot of concern about the waste tires, and so there is also a lot of marketing of alternative infills, and so those include alternative rubber products like EPDM rubber, or plastic products like thermoplastic elastomer. There has been an acrylic coated sand product. There are various plant-based products. There's a wood-based version. There are versions made from coconut and cork. So a wide variety of options. And I could say more about all of those.
Nike. I read about Nike. It disposes a lot of their sneakers and their rubber from their shoes. They have this whole secondary business of recycling their sneakers and the plastic and rubber to make synthetic turf infill.
Right. So again, basically it's a waste rubber product. And so Well, let's see. So I'm just thinking about what order to cover this in. So we can talk about the chemicals in the infill, and then there are chemicals in the rest of the system as well. Because again, anytime you're working with a plastic product, there are plenty of chemicals in there, and most of them are not necessarily disclosed, or so it's not necessarily all that easy to find out exactly what they are. So, all right. So now let's just talk about the tires a little more. So tires contain a large number of chemicals. EPA, so you mentioned the work that EPA did in 2008, 2009. So they also did additional work in 2016. And they did a literature review where they looked at all the literature that was currently available about chemicals in tire crumb or in waste tire materials. And they identified more than 350 chemicals that have been discussed in that literature at that time. Since then, more literature has emerged. So the basic categories of chemicals that are, just sort of worth being aware of or thinking about, there are metals, including metals such as lead and zinc. There are polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, many of which are carcinogens. There's a wide variety of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, as well as semi-volatile organic compounds, SVOCs. And then there's a whole lot of additional chemicals that are a little bit hard to classify by chemical category, but we can kind of list them off by use. So there's antioxidants, antiozonants, stabilizers, and then there's vulcanization compounds, among others. So vulcanization compounds are there to make it into a vulcanized rubber product. So if you think about a tire doesn't melt on a hot day. That's because it's a vulcanized rubber product. So what that means is you've got this like squishy, sticky rubber product that you're starting with. You add chemicals, smaller chemicals that can form cross-linking bonds among the polymer strands. And so you mix that all together, I'm simplifying here, but subject it to heat and pressure, and bonds form, those little compounds form links among the larger polymer strands, and it forms a shape that's not going to just like change shape and melt. So it's essential to the function of the product. But so that's like a whole lot more chemicals. And so there are the cross-linking chemicals, there are the accelerators, and so forth. And so when you think about all the chemicals that are in tires, many of them are well understood to have adverse health effects. Many of them are carcinogens. Many of them have simply not been studied, so we don't really know what their health effects are. And then, of course, it's a mixture. And I'm sure, as many of your listeners already know, exposure to mixtures of multiple low-dose chemicals is a significant health concern. And before I stop going on about chemicals in tires, I just mention a couple other things. So I mentioned the polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So after that EPA literature review was completed, some researchers did additional research on those PAHs, and they identified a whole bunch of other PAHs that are also in tires that just hadn't really been focused on.
Right.
And when you do a standard test for PAHs, you don't get the whole list of them. And PAHs vary a lot in carcinogenicity. Some of them are much more carcinogenic than others. And then another kind of emerging piece of information, let me know if I'm just going on too much about this one topic.
No, you are not.
Okay.
No, you are not. Bring it.
So there's also been new information just in the past few years about a chemical that is used as an anti-ozonant in tires. So the abbreviation is 6-PPD. And this is a chemical that actually composes about 1% of that tire formulation. And this chemical, when it's oxidized, its transformation product is 6-PPD quinone. And that chemical has been identified as the source of mortality of coho salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And this is really a big discovery. So there have been these massive die-offs of the coho salmon, and people didn't know what was causing it. And the researchers narrowed down. So they took the tire leachate and they tested that and found that killed coho salmon. And then they narrowed down, sort of further and further until they could identify that one specific chemical. So
I remember that came out in the news. It got picked up by a lot of media, but not enough, I think. And it was just a couple of years ago, but that was a significant finding because it's showing that all of our, just like in the fashion industry, we don't always follow through where these, chemicals wash into, including the PFAS chemicals. So, yeah, that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah. And of course, we know very little about human exposure and human health effects of that chemical. So there's some very new research, some biomonitoring research that does also find that chemical in humans. But again, it's something that has not, it's new research. Mm-hmm. And then the one other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that there's also been research on the tire leachate as a mixture. So, for example, there was a study that looked at the effects on chicken embryos of tire leachate. So they injected that, they extracted chemicals into water, injected it into the yolk of the developing chicken embryo, and found adverse effects on embryo development. So again, there's a lot still being learned about the health effects of exposure to that entire mixture.
Right. And leachate is basically just the runoff. It's just sort of like the mushed up, the material that comes out of the soaking, like you mentioned.
That's right.
Yeah. It's not the actual part, the stuff you can feel and touch with your hands, but perhaps even just what's kind of leaches off the material into a liquid or soluble liquid.
That's right.
So, and also the VOCs I wanted to make mention is some of the people listening won't know that VOCs are volatile organic compounds. And so the chemicals or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, some of these which aerate off, you don't see them. You may smell them. I mean, certainly when you go into a bubble and watch your kid play soccer or sports on a synthetic turf that now has a bubble. I don't want to get me started on that, but it does smell. And that can be part of either the bubble itself that's made of plastic, or it could be really likely to be, ice, keeping those gases and those off-gassed VOCs from these materials in a very closed with poor aeration and poor ventilation in these spaces.
Yeah, that's right. And there have been studies of indoor artificial turf fields with tire crumb, and they certainly found high levels of a variety of chemicals and just high levels of that of rubber particulates in the dust, in the air, in those indoor settings.
Another thing I wanted to mention was when I watch my kids play sports in the hot sun in the summertime, similar to what you see off cement and heat pounding cement and pavement, I saw from the side the kind of the air staying close to the hot turf, where you could kind of almost see these gases coming off of the blades of grass, let alone the tire crumb. And it was really alarming because of the amount of time my kids and the players all spent on the ground and very close to the ground. So, that's an issue with heavy metals and, lead, arsenic coming off of the blades as well, right?
Well, and I would just say that heat is a significant concern with artificial turf. So on warm, sunny days, artificial turf surfacing gets extremely hot, and that increases concerns for youth being exposed to heat hazards. There are some school districts that have taken a particular approach to addressing this. So, for example, the school district in Burlington, Massachusetts has adopted a heat policy which explicitly takes account of surface temperature. So in general, when heat policies are being developed, they look at measures of ambient temperature, but that doesn't take account of the fact that artificial turf surfacing gets extremely hot. Just at that surface.
Right, 160 degrees I saw, anywhere from 60 to 160 degrees because it can hold on to that air very close to the ground because of all that material. Yes, that was one of the recommendations I saw, was watching those temperatures and, having, like you said, some schools are using that as part of their policy on how to handle synthetic turf if they can't remove it. On a cellular level, can you speak to some of the, maybe even some of the chemicals and how they work on a cellular level? Because I could share some of what I learned from another researcher just recently who presented a paper.
I'd love to hear what you've got on that.
Okay. Yeah. And it's just interesting because a colleague of mine, and you probably know him as well, Chris Cassotis' lab, at Wayne State University, they just presented a paper at the International Meeting, Society of Toxicology. And here's the paper. And basically, really quickly, they looked at 18 turf samples. And they looked at these samples not just from the manufacturing, but also ones that were actually on live fields, school playgrounds. And full disclosure, I submitted 9 samples because I live and come to these games and public fields quite a bit. So I offered up those samples. But interestingly enough, these 18 turf samples really showed a lot of cellular. I mean, his lab really looked at the cellular activity, the hormonal activity. And without getting too specific with the science, there were 2 really important things that came out of these samples. Number one, 7 out of 7 of the commercial turf extracts, which are the ones that came right from the manufacturing, showed this activated aryl hydrol receptor. Basically the receptors were disrupted, meaning that there's endocrine disruption potential because of the way they did the science. And these were, human cells that they inserted receptors and kind of measured the activity once they were exposed. So 7 out of 7. So all of the commercial turf that they tested showed activity, which is in and of itself a problem. But what's also interesting is the field turf 50% showed a metabolic effect, basically, that 5 out of the 10 samples that were from the field, so playgrounds that are already, ones that I borrowed and some other samples, really showed this activity where it could be metabolically, enhance fat cell development and endocrine disruption. But the more weathered samples really showed higher activity. And discuss what weathered means to this audience, because really it showed that a lot of it was really just bad. It was not a great study in the terms of this. I mean, a good study, but it was not great results. It was really, upsetting. But something we might all suspect, and you can see this. I'm going to see if I can publish this on our website as well, because this just was made public. So tell us a little bit about weathered and what that means and what to think about moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really important information. And so on weathered versus not weathered materials, so that's just how we distinguish between a new turf sample that hasn't ever been played on, hasn't been outdoors, versus a sample of that material that has been outdoors for some number of months or years. And of course, since particles are migrating off the product over its useful life and certain chemicals are off-gassing or washing off in rainwater, you might get different results if you look at the new product versus the weathered product. And of course, you've had the effect of sun and the effect of chemicals in the air. Anyway, all those chemical reactions that could be occurring. So So that's why when we look at an artificial turf study, we distinguish between studies that looked at that new material versus studies that have looked at weathered material. And I think, the information that you just shared, I think is part of a growing trend to do scientific research where we're looking at the mixtures that people are actually exposed to, and then looking at the effects of those mixtures on human cells. And maybe that can kind of help leapfrog us forward from these debates that we've been having for years about all the individual chemicals and their health effects. And then, people continue to have questions about, is this really relevant for my health? And so I think studies like this really, really help to show the relevance for human health. I think it's really urgent to answer these questions. And I think one thing that it's important for us all to stay clear about is the research is important, and we don't need the research results in order to be able to take action.
So tell us what that is. Yeah. Great segue, Rachel. Go right into what you are doing and what are you teaching people based on your knowledge?
Yeah, and I'll say about both of those. So in terms of the importance of the research, there are people who have been asking for many, many years now for answers, right? So there are kids who have grown up as like your kids, kids who have grown up being exposed to these materials for many hours per week. And people have questions about whether this has increased the risk of certain diseases. And there has really been a lack of well-designed, there hasn't been any well-designed epidemiological study up until now. So just the people who have these questions and who've had these exposures deserve answers. So I'm really glad that these researchers are taking this on. And then at the same time, we don't need research results in order to know that there are prevention opportunities. So would you like me to talk a little bit about natural grass as a safer alternative?
Yes, but just before you get into that, because I know we had talked about this prior to this recording, but tell us a little bit about Amy Griffin, because and the concern over the soccer goalies, because I think a lot of people remember these stories hitting the evening news about the soccer coach or assistant soccer coach at Washington University or University of Washington. Tell us a little bit about what she was thinking about all of her athletes, her student athletes that were developing cancers, just as a way of segueing into what your recommendations are.
Sure. Yeah. Right. So for anybody who doesn't already know, Amy Griffin is an elite women's soccer coach in Washington State. And around 2009, she had some players she was working with who were diagnosed with cancer. There was one key moment when she went with one of her soccer players to a chemotherapy treatment, and the nurse who was doing the chemo said, I've had several goalies recently that I've treated, and this sort of got Amy and the other players started on thinking about this. And so they started compiling a list of soccer players with cancer, and then that expanded more to other athletes with cancer. And that list just grew over time. And I think you have the latest numbers, so you can share those.
It started off at like 55 or 60, I think she could gather at that time, which is almost 10 years ago, really. And then now it's up to 260 that she can gather. And these are not just goalies, but these are a lot of, athletes, high level athletes, people who have been doing, having exposure for a long period of time to synthetic turf. And so that's where we stand now with those numbers.
Yeah. Thank you for giving those numbers. And so, it's important to understand that Amy Griffin and the other people who worked on this with her were doing this as a service to collect the information from concerned people, from players and from parents, and then to provide that information to people who could do a systematic study. And so they provided that information to the Washington Department of Health, and the Washington Department of Health essentially declined to look into it. So they did some kind of funny calculations. So they created a case definition, and they took the list of about maybe 50 that they'd been given. They narrowed that down to 20 some that met their case definition. That's fine, that's valid. And then they did kind of a back of the envelope calculation to estimate the total number of young people in a certain set of years who might have ever played soccer, who might have been diagnosed with cancer based on existing cancer rates. And so that came out to 1,300 and some. And so then they took that number, let's say 26 or 20 some, and they compared it with the over 1,000 that could potentially have, lived in Washington State and played soccer and developed cancer. And they said, oh, well, this list that we've gotten from Amy Griffin is only 2% of the total number of people who could have developed cancer. And they basically left it there. So that was a meaningless calculation and kind of surprising that was what was done. And then, they asked other questions like, has there been a novel exposure? And they said, well, no, there hasn't been a novel exposure. Well,
what is novel exposure?
Well, I would say it's a novel exposure that in the 1990s we started having children playing on waste tires. That was novel because that wasn't happening earlier. So it's just, it's just sort of a way of, it's like semantics.
Discounting.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically they chose not to investigate the possibility of a cancer cluster in any depth, and they didn't do any active identification of cases. And I think that really kind of set things back. But anyway, so I'm very happy that Leo Tresunde and others are going to be looking into this. That's really important.
Yeah. And I think it, like everything else, everything, sort of gains a groundswell, and it has to affect enough people and people to really start to make those, those studies happen, have the funding available. And of course, we're further than we were, but we're also, again, we're adding 12 to 1,500 fields, according to the council, the Turf Council, per year. So it's kind of like a whack-a-mole. We're trying to get to a place where we can halt this excitement and really do, due diligence.
Yeah. And actually, so I'll just add something there, which is just when we think about epidemiological studies, I just always remember something that was said by Dr. David Ozanoff, who's an epidemiologist, and he said that his definition of a public health disaster is something that you can pick up in an epidemiological study. So by the time we actually see evidence of increased risk of disease in an epidemiological study, it means you have many, many people who have gotten sick, enough that signal can come out from all the noise. So again, really important to do those studies. And ideally, you don't want to have to ever do that study. You want to reduce toxics or eliminate toxics upfront so that you never have to do the study.
All right. So hit me. Tell us all what you recommend based on, the situation we're in now. We're living, I have kids, they have practice, literally a game tonight and game tomorrow. What do we tell parents and what do we teach our kids if we're teaching, we have the ability to pass that information on to students? So in terms of just kids being protected if they are playing on artificial turf fields, then I would rely on the recommendations from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Their Institute of Exposomic Research has done great work on this, and they have a set of recommendations, and that includes very simple things like shake out your shoes before you get in the car, brush your hair thoroughly to get that material out of your hair, shower immediately after playing on an artificial turf field, avoid picnicking or snacking or other just passive recreation activities on these surfaces. Keep a close eye on small children. Try not to have small children on those surfaces. So those are just like simple things to reduce your exposure a little bit if you need to be playing on these surfaces. And also very important for parents, I think, is to be aware of the heat hazards. These chemical issues are a chronic issue over time, but a single extremely hot day of playing on an extremely hot surface could be really dangerous for your child. So that's something that just every parent should just keep an eye on. So those are just, what you can do if you're already. Yeah, I have a couple nuances.
Yeah.
So I have boys and sometimes they forget the soap. So you want to think about, I found that out the hard way when my kids came back from camp. But the idea is that, these are petroleum-based chemicals. They are, in effect, waterproof. And in fact, with the PFAS chemicals and many of the waterproof chemicals used in the production and manufacturing of even the blades of grass, we could expect that those chemicals will also be waterproof on our skin. And so would you agree you would definitely need soap, but if you're really going to remove these products?
That definitely sounds reasonable to me.
Or compounds.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, good. Yeah. And that's one thing. And then also the ventilation. I mean, I can't really keep my kids from the bubble, but, we certainly don't hang out there and have a Mai Tai and a picnic. But the idea is get in and get out. Yeah. The other thing I was going to mention is ACL tears. And I talk about this in our book, Fred and my books, Non-Toxic. We talk about not just even the chemical exposure risk, but there's also some real mechanical issues with turf, which I'm not going to hold you to talking about, but I want to make mention that there are higher rates of ACL tears. It's much more slippery when wet. And it's just something for parents to think about in terms of knee injuries for their children who are developing. So it may be something to think about in terms of extra bracing or ace bandages or something that you can get some more support, especially if there's injury or open cuts. You want to make sure you close cuts, abrasions before you go onto the field to avoid that, exposure into those open wounds or into your mouth.
Yeah. And I would just add that skin abrasions are a serious concern with artificial turf. So it definitely is associated with much greater risk of serious skin abrasions. And then those skin abrasions in turn are associated with increased risk of serious bacterial infections.
Oh, interesting. And I also mentioned about, things like shoes in general, which we get covered with junk, including pesticides from the outdoors. You may want to have a bucket outside your house for when you come home from games and everyone just kind of takes off those shoes that might have exposed, or even washing paws from animals that are on turf as well. So just a couple of things to add to your list. So where do we go from here? I mean, we have playgrounds now that have some of this material. We have an incredible love of these turf. I mean, everyone talks about, these kids talk about the sports turfs when they're applying to schools or changing schools or going to colleges. They all talk about the synthetic turf and how great it would be to play in these fields. Where do we go from here? I mean, we have the recommendations, but in terms of regulatory policy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Okay. I feel like you just brought up several really interesting themes. So let me try not to forget them all. But so just briefly about playgrounds. So yes, so some of these same materials are used in playgrounds. And so playgrounds sometimes have unitary surfacing, so a pour-in-place surfacing, which is like a rubber mix bound together with a binder. And then under that, there are layers of shredded rubber. And what I have noticed at many playgrounds, maybe you've noticed this as well, is that those pour-in-place surfaces fall apart pretty quickly. So you quickly end up with that unitary rubber surfacing and then a big hole in it, like a hole under the swing or a hole at the bottom of the slide. And then right under that, again, is shredded tires or other rubber shreds. And again, if you look at the area around playgrounds, you see all those little bits of rubber dispersed from there. Also, in some cases, playgrounds are actually surfaced just with straight tire shreds. And so then if you've got small children, you're just putting those small children directly into shredded waste tires. And I didn't mention earlier, so I should just mention now that when we think about the chemicals in tires, it's not just the chemicals that were used in manufacturing the tires, it's also the chemicals that those tires have picked up over the course of their useful life as a tire.
I was going to also say how, in addition to the chemicals that tires pick up over their lifespan, but there's also how you clean these materials, and there might be antimicrobials even added to sports turf, to tires, what have you, because those antimicrobials have endocrine disrupting effects as well. Triclosan is one of the ones that made the news, but there's all sorts of other chemicals that are added again to maintain these surfaces for turf. So thoughts on that?
Yes. And it's also just important to remember that artificial turf is not maintenance free. So there's a whole range of activities that need to be done to keep it in that nice condition that it was in when you first purchased it. So you have to continue, you have to replenish the infill, you have to groom and brush it. You have to do testing to make sure that it's maintained its resiliency. And many of the specifications call for periodic treatment with chemicals to sanitize or disinfect that rubber and plastic surfacing. So yes. Let's see.
So what are the I was going to say, with all this bad news about this turf, really, in many ways, I would say, what are the alternatives of going back to grass really realistic, given that there's risks possibly to pesticides or other maintenance issues for, where do you stand and what do you tell people?
Yeah. So we often hear from communities where they have grass fields and they're not happy with their grass fields. They're not being adequately maintained. They're muddy. There's, the grass has been torn up, or there's water pooling on the field, or it's uneven, the surface is uneven. And then they're thinking about replacing it with an artificial turf field. as a solution to those problems. So certainly in those cases, they're just very straightforward things that communities can do. So they can adopt sustainable management of natural grass fields. And there are just a few techniques that they can easily adopt that will really improve the quality of those fields. So frequent aeration of the fields. So an aerator is you run it across the field, and it just like makes little holes in the field so that oxygen can get in, and that helps to support soil and root health, and soil and grass health, build a healthy root system, support beneficial soil microorganisms being able to thrive in that soil. So I guess basically the straightforward, safer alternative to artificial turf is sustainably managed natural grass. And there's a whole range of levels of investment. So if you just kind of have a field that's not particularly well maintained, you can start aerating, do some soil testing to find out what soil nutrients the field needs. You can do a certain amount of adding soil amendments or fertilizers based on that soil testing. You can do overseeding, and you can, if you have like a little bit more bandwidth, you can choose appropriate grass seeds to really choose the types of grass that will form really strong root systems and also provide a nice amount of grass growing. And then if a community has the resources that they are interested in making a big capital investment and building something new, you can rebuild a natural grass field. And you can build it with a great drainage system and a sand cap so that the rainwater will run off readily, so that you don't have to do that, but it's absolutely an option. And what I find is it's often not apples to apples. So communities are making decisions about, on the one hand, should they make a little bit more investment in their grass fields versus on the other hand, should they make a big capital investment in a new artificial turf field? And then often there are kind of other financial issues that are coming into play where there's an opportunity to borrow funds, or there's an outside donor. Sometimes a national nonprofit might be coming in and offering a donation to help a community put in an artificial turf field. And so then sort of the finances get a little bit confusing. But anyway, so these are some of the issues that we hear about frequently. And now we're increasingly hearing from communities that are getting in touch and saying, do you have any information on what it would take to get rid of our artificial turf field entirely and replace it with natural grass? And so far, I have to say I haven't done detailed research on exactly how you do that and what the finances of it are, but there are people who are specialized in doing that. And there are communities now that are doing it, so communities can learn from one another.
So just, the question is going to be, when is it going to be sexy to have grass again? It's like, when are we going to go back
Right.
to what our grandparents had and our parents had? And it's like this, right now I can't seem to convince my kids that grass is better because they're athletes and they just, they've drank the Kool-Aid literally and figuratively. So, we'll see when this kind of hits a groundswell and sort of there's a tipping point. At this point, they just hear me, talking in the background. So, I hope communities will take this very seriously. I'm certainly going to pass this conversation on to a lot of, I hope, people who care and are interested in this topic to see if they can kind of make moves. So, I guess with all the work you've done, which is remarkable, number one, what is the work now? I guess you're part of, Collaborative for Health and the Environment, which I hope people will check out. It's CHE is what we all look up when we're looking on the internet, but it is Collaborative for Health and the Environment. So tell me what you're up to in terms of the projects that you're working on, and then also how do people get in touch with you if they have questions or want to work with you on some level and find out more?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. So yes, our work with the Collaborative for Health and Environment, the website is healthandenvironment.org. And some of the work actually that we're doing is a little bit similar to what you're doing with this podcast. It's kind of trying to find ways to share emerging science with people in the interests of getting changes with policy and practices. And so we did a recent series on building materials and children's health and environmental justice. We also had a webinar recently that people might be interested in on the disastrous derailment of the Norfolk Southern train in East Palestine, Ohio last month. Just going over the chemicals that were released, both through that original spill and through the subsequent burning of those chemicals. So that just might be something that your listeners might be interested in. And then we're going to be doing some projects looking more broadly at issues related to plastics. So many of these topics that we've covered related to turf are relevant to plastics more generally. So, turf is essentially a very large plastic and rubber product, and we've got a lot of plastic products around us. And I think people generally know that we have serious problems globally with plastic waste. And we also need to have more discussion about the toxic chemicals in plastics. So those include the building blocks of plastics, the monomers that are used to put together those polymers. Some of those are highly toxic throughout the life cycle. And then there are additives. And there are lots of plastics additives. Many of them have adverse health effects. And there's a lack of disclosure. So we don't necessarily always know what's in those plastic products. So we're going to be doing some work on that as well. And all of that, much of that work is done in partnership with other organizations, in particular, a partnership called the EDC Strategies Partnership. So that's the Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals Strategies Partnership that is sponsoring many of those projects. So anyway, that might be a few things that some of your listeners might be interested in. And in terms of finding our materials on turf, those are all available on the website of the Toxics Use Reduction Institute. And so people can go to turi.org/artificial turf or turi.org/athletic fields. Either of those should take you to all of those materials.
Fantastic. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for those resources. I think there's also, is there another, the Healthy Buildings Project, is that also another resource?
Yes. So
yeah, go ahead.
Actually, yes, thank you. Healthy Building Network is a wonderful resource, and they have what's called a hazard spectrum for athletic fields. Mm-hmm. So they've collected detailed information on the chemicals present in the various materials, and they've got a spectrum that goes from on the one end artificial turf with tire crumb to on the other end sustainably managed natural grass. So that's a really great resource. And also I encourage people to look at the website of the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Again, their Institute for Exposomic Research has really excellent materials.
We're going to have all these links for this episode so that people can get it all in one shot. And
Great.
Do you encourage people to really talk to their legislators, their mayors, their governors? I mean, is this something that you feel is kind of a grassroots effort as well?
I mean, there certainly are lots of grassroots efforts that are occurring related to turf. There's work at the municipal level and at the state level. And then there are regulations that have been adopted in some cases. Well, for example, in the European Union, there are now some regulations around microplastics and around polyaromatic hydrocarbons in fills. So there are definitely opportunities to engage with this at a policy at any level of policy making.
That's great. And in the meantime, precautionary principles, less is more, less exposure, keep your kids clean, keep your bodies clean, use soap. Tell that to my kids. And
right.
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff we can do in the meantime. So it's not just,
Yeah.
So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. And I would say that's kind of a message that is just important to bear in mind, leaving aside turf, just for environmental health in general. It can get a little overwhelming as you learn about the wide variety of exposures that might occur. But any place where you're able to make a change, there's always some room for prevention. And any preventive step that you take does make a difference. And we're not going to get really better protection of public health overall unless we change policies at the federal and state levels. But while we're waiting for policy to catch up with the science, there are lots of steps that people can take.
So a couple other questions I want to sneak in. I know this may be edited back in, so in case there's a blip for viewers. Tell me a little bit about exposures in young people and in utero development, in terms of exposures to pregnant women, in terms of many chemicals, including, I guess you could even argue turf, of course, environmental, tire crumb. And then also lead me into sort of more of a general question as to exposures and what your thoughts are in terms of so many of these overwhelming chemicals and how we need to manage those.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess just, when I think about, what are the take-home messages that people should have in mind about toxic chemical exposures? Again, it's very hard to keep track of everything. There are so many potential sources of exposure as you start to learn about them. But one important thing to bear in mind is that exposures that occur during fetal development have effects throughout the lifespan. And so if there are things that are just like a little bit too hard to do most of the time, but they can be done during pregnancy to protect that developing fetus, it's worth making those extra efforts. And that includes exposure to chemicals in plastics, exposure to chemicals in personal care products. It also includes being extremely careful about medications, including over-the-counter medications, and including in that first trimester, that very crucial first trimester
Right.
of pregnancy. And Aly, I know you cover all of this in your book. And I just think these are really important things for people to bear in mind. Again, can't do everything,
Right.
but that's a good place to focus. And then another just note is that I think it is really worthwhile for all of us to get up to speed on the emerging science on potential health effects of wireless technologies. And I'm not going to try to summarize that science here, but I would just note for your listeners, we all need to get up to speed on it. And that includes health professionals as well, need to just start following that science.
And that also goes with the precautionary principle. I mean, even the very basics of not putting a phone, which is essentially an antenna, too close to your body because it's going to be absorbing the radiation getting to that phone. It's a microwave. I mean, it's like being in a microwave without the microwave protecting you. I mean, the box, the Faraday box. But no, I think this is actually really important information. And I'm glad someone like yourself who does a lot of this research is really saying this, not, myself as just a clinician. And then how do we get, how do we move the needle in regulation? And what are the things that will actually push us towards real change that we need for the public?
Yeah, so there are lots of ways in which we could change the way we regulate chemicals at the federal level, and some of them are really aspirational, but some of these things really we could be doing them tomorrow. There's actually a set of studies that just came out from the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment at UCSF, where they laid out a set of changes that EPA could make right now in their implementation of chemical regulation. So one example is to do more regulation of chemicals as classes. So for example, many people have heard about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. There are thousands of these chemicals. Regulators have been working hard to regulate just a handful of them in drinking water. This is an example of a chemical category where if we keep doing just one chemical at a time, we're never going to get to where we need to be. But if we group chemicals in logical ways and deal with them as classes, that can really move us forward. And then there are other key improvements that could be made, for example, in the way we do exposure assessment. So a lot of regulatory decision making is based on risk assessment. And without going into how all that works, exposure assessment is one of the things that you feed into a risk assessment. There are lots of difficulties along the way, but one thing you can do is just be a little bit more realistic in how you design risk assessments. So one example that again came out from our colleagues at the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment, and this was a study led by Dr. Laura Vandenberg, was an example that they shared was when we assess exposure to bisphenol A on receipts. The exposure assessment was done making an assumption that adults touch receipts with 2 fingers. So it doesn't take account of the fact that you might crumple a receipt in your hand, or you might use a receipt to blot some of the grease off a slice of pizza. And so just being a little bit more realistic in those exposure assessments, again, that's not going to fix the larger problems with chemical regulation, but it would get us a little bit closer to some health protective policies.
Yeah, and protective meaning prevention. I mean, really what we're saying is let's prevent these problems before they become, true clinical illness, and that's based on what we know so much about in terms of these exposures of toxic chemicals. So
exactly.
Dr. Rachel Massey, thank you so much for your time, but more importantly as well, thank you so much for the effort and the research and just your lifelong passion for helping us to reduce these environmental chemicals in ways that will be helpful to our health. And thank you for the work you've been doing over the past, decade or two and what you continue to bring forth to the public. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your wealth of knowledge.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your wonderful work. And again, I really loved reading your book. Very happy to discover it. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
My pleasure. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much. Take care.